So at this point of the course, you're already pretty good at working with the DOM, but there are still a ton of things to learn. So to do that, in this section, we will build a beautiful website project with a lot of different components and visual effects that require some pretty advanced DOM manipulation techniques. So after this section, you will have all the tools that you need in order to implement any visual component or effect that you can imagine. Now, many of the things that I'm going to show you here could actually also be added to a web page simply by using a third-party library. But you want to master JavaScript and the DOM, right? And so therefore, you need to know how to do things yourself. And so, let's go learn advanced DOM manipulation now. So in this section, we're going to build yet another project. So let's start by taking a look at it. So over the last two sections, we built the application for a fictional bank called Bankist. Now in this section, we're going to be building the kind of marketing website for the same fictional bank. So again, that's Bankist here. And so let's take a look at it. Now, of course, all of this HTML and CSS that you see here is already provided for you in the starter files. But all the effects that you see here going on will be built by us throughout this section. So maybe you already saw this section here fading in and moving a little bit. And also notice here what happens with these images. So it's basically lazy loading these images as we scroll to them. So here you saw also this section fading in. Maybe you already also noticed that the menu bar has become sticky here at the top. And when we hover over each of these links, then all the other links get grayed out. You see? And so all of that is done using JavaScript. And also here you get this nice pop-up window. And so again, that's JavaScript. Here we have this component, which is a tabbed component, which is pretty common to see in modern user interfaces. And so you will learn how to do this as well. Then again, this section here sliding in. And here we have the coolest component of all of them, which is this slider. So as we click here, you see, basically we have these three slides with these three dots, and we are circling through them as we click these arrows or even these dots. So these dots, they work just the same as the arrows. And I'm sure you have seen a slider like this. And so now you will learn one way of building a really cool slider. Just like this one. And here again, we will have the pop-up window. And of course, if we click here, then we get a smooth scrolling animation to that part of the page. And the same here on this button. Okay, so you see there are a lot of dynamic effects going on here on this page. And so I hope you're really excited for this project because you will learn how to do all of them. And these are for sure some of the most important and commonly used effects that you will see on all websites. And so that's why I decided to include this project in the course so that you can learn how to do them yourself. I also tried to design a really nice and beautiful website, which looks like a real marketing page of a real company. And so if you include this in your portfolio, then I'm sure it will look really cool on your portfolio too. So I hope you like this page, that you like the effects that we're going to implement, and that you're just as excited as I am to get started with this project. So anyway, please open up your starter files that I provided for this project. And so there you have this big HTML file that I will explain you as necessary. Then this huge style sheet with hundreds of lines of code that I wrote just for this project. And then of course the script.js. Now here I already included the code for the modal window because this is actually exactly the code that we wrote before in one of the projects. Remember that? So this is exactly the same. And so if we start our project, it should actually already be working. So let's open up here our console, live server. And so this is the page here. Now I'm seeing this page at, I think, 75%. Yeah, because otherwise it looks really ugly, right? And at this point also, nothing works yet as it did in the demo project because the JavaScript is simply not yet written. And so, of course, nothing works here. And everything looks a little bit weird. So let's go back to 75%. But what should already be working is this pop-up. So this modal window. And again, that is because it is exactly the same code that we already wrote before. Now there are just two small changes that I want to do here in this code very quick before we get started. The first one is watch what happens if we click this button here, like in this position. So you see that the page scrolled back to the top. And that is because, let me show you here. So that's because this is actually now a link and not a button. And on a link, when we have this hash here as the hyperlink, so as href, then that will make the page jump to the top. So that's the default behavior when we click a link that has this hyperlink here. And so if that is the default, we already know a way of preventing that default, right? Do you remember how? Well, all we need here is in this function, which is the one responsible for opening this model, is to get access to the event, and then on the event we call prevent default. So hopefully you remember that from earlier. So let's see again. And this time the page didn't jump. So we fixed that. And now the second part that I want to quickly fix is getting rid of this old school for loop that we have here. Because now we know of a better way of doing this, which is the for each loop. So we have this buttons open modal, which is a node list. And it's a node list because it's the result of query selector all. All right. Now remember that a node list is not an array, but still it does have the for each method. So it doesn't have most of the methods that arrays have, but for each is one of the methods that a node list has as well. And so let's use that now. So buttons open modal dot for each. And so remember that we did this loop here in the first place because we wanted to add an event listener to each of the buttons. So in our case, that's this button here and also this one down here. So this one. Well, for some reason it's not working right now. But let's first finish this. All right. So anyway, we want to attach an event listener to this button and to this one here at the same time. And so that's why we did this loop. But now we have a better way of doing it, which is by simply providing a callback function here to for each. So each one will be a button. And then on that button, we will simply add an event listener. And so that's simply this part. And so now this is exactly the same as this, but in a lot easier way. So let's give it a save. And that works. And let's check the other one as well. And yeah. So this one works as well. And so with this, our code is a little bit nicer and adapted to this page. All right. So we are ready to get started in this section. And we will do that right in the next video by learning a little bit more about how the DOM actually works behind the scenes. Let's start this section by learning how the DOM really works behind the scenes, and more specifically, how the DOM is organized internally. This will make it easier to understand everything else that's gonna follow in this section. So first, remember that the DOM is basically the interface between our JavaScript code and the browser, or more specifically, HTML documents that are rendered in and by the browser. Now, we have written a ton of JavaScript code in this course so far, but many times completely without interacting with the browser. So without using the DOM, right? But now we're back to working with web pages, and therefore with the DOM. And this time we're gonna learn as much as possible about the DOM and how to create amazing dynamic effects. So let's remember what we already know about the DOM, which is that we can use it to make JavaScript interact with the browser. And again, more specifically, we can create and modify and delete elements, set styles and classes and attributes, and listen and respond to events. In practice, this works because a DOM tree is generated from any HTML document. And a DOM tree is a tree-like structure made out of nodes, which looks something like this. And we can then interact with this tree as we already did a couple of times in this course. Now, how does that interaction actually work? Well, the DOM is a very complex API, which, remember, stands for Application Programming Interface. So it's the interface that we can use to programmatically interact with the DOM. In practice, that means that the DOM contains a ton of methods and properties that we use to interact with the DOM tree, such as the query selector, add event listener, or create element methods, or also the inner HTML, text content, or children properties, and many, many more. Now, in the DOM, there are different types of nodes, just as I mentioned before. For example, some nodes are HTML elements, but others are just text. Remember? And this is really important to understand because all these DOM methods and properties are organized into these different types of objects. And so let's now take a look at how the DOM API is organized behind the scenes. So first, every single node in the DOM tree is of the type node. And such as everything else in JavaScript, each node is represented in JavaScript by an object. This object gets access to special node methods and properties, such as text content, child nodes, parent node, clone node, and many others. Now, we already know that there are different types of nodes, right? So how should these be represented? Well, this node type has a couple of child types, so to say. And these are the element type, the text type, the comment type, and also the document type. So whenever there is text inside any element, we already know that it gets its own node, right? And that node will be of the type text. And the same actually happens for HTML comments. And that's because the rule is that everything that's in the HTML has to go into the DOM as well. Now, for the element itself, there is the element type of node. And this type of node gives each HTML element access to a ton of useful properties, such as inner HTML, class list, children, or parent element. There are also many useful methods, like append, remove, insert adjacent HTML, query selector, closest, and that's just to name a few. So again, each element will be represented internally as an object. Now, just to make this complete, the element type has internally an HTML element child type. And that element type itself has exactly one child type for each HTML element that exists in HTML. So we have a special type for buttons, a special type for images, for links, and so on and so forth. And that's important because each of these HTML elements can have different unique properties. For example, an image has a source attribute in HTML which no other element has. Or the anchor element for links has the href attribute which also no other element has. And so the DOM needs a way of storing these different attributes, and therefore different types of HTML elements were created in the DOM API. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, this diagram that I'm showing you here is of course not a DOM tree, right? So this is not a representation of any HTML document. This is just the way that different types of nodes are represented behind the scenes in the DOM API. All right? But anyway, now comes the really important part. Because what makes all of this work is something called inheritance. So what is inheritance? Well, inheritance means that all the child types will also get access to the methods and properties of all their parent node types. For example, an HTML element will get access to everything from the element type, like inner HTML or class list or all these other methods and properties. And besides that, it will also get access to everything from the node type, because that is also its parent type. Okay? So we can think of this as if the HTML button element, for example, is also an element and also a node. All right? Now, this may all seem a bit weird and confusing, but don't worry. We will learn why this kind of inheritance works very soon when we finally talk about object-oriented JavaScript. For now, what I want you to understand is that the DOM API is broken up into these different types of nodes. I also want you to understand that each of these types of nodes has access to different properties and methods, and that some of them even inherit more properties and methods from their ancestors in this organization. All right? Now, we didn't talk yet about the document node type. So, document, which we use all the time in DOM manipulation, is in fact just another type of node. So it contains important methods such as query selector, create element, and get element by ID. And note how query selector is available on both the document and the element types. So keep this in mind because it will be important later on. All right, and now there is just one final missing piece here, because the DOM API actually needs a way of allowing all the node types to listen to events. And remember, we usually listen for events by calling the addEventListener method on an element or the document, right? So why does that actually work? Well, it's because there is a special node type called eventTarget, which is a parent of both the node type and also the window node type. And so with this, thanks to inheritance, we can call addEventListener on every single type of node in the DOM API. Because all elements, as well as document and window, and even text and comment, will inherit this method. And therefore, we will be able to use addEventListener on all of them, just as if it was their own method. Now, just to be clear, we do never manually create an event target object. Okay? This is just an abstract type that we do not use in practice. This all really happens behind the scenes to make all the functionality work as we expect it to work. So, in a nutshell, this is how the DOM API works and is structured behind the scenes. There are still some simplifications here, but this is all that really matters. And I really wish that I could have had this diagram when I learned JavaScript for the first time, because I really think that this helps structuring all this information in your mind. Now, if you want to go even deeper than this, there is still tons of material that you can check out in the MDN documentation. And if you ask me, it's all really fascinating. But again, all that you need to know is really in this lecture. It took me a lot of hours to put this one together, but I think it was well worth it. And I hope you think the same. But anyway, let's now move on to the practical part of this section, where we will then finally use many of these things in action. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to select, create, and delete elements with JavaScript. Now, the goal of this lecture is more to be like a quick reference for you in the future, because these methods that I'm going to show you here are actually way more difficult to find and to understand from the MDN documentation. And so when you need some of these methods in the future, then all you have to do is to come back to this lecture and see how it works. And let's start by learning a little bit more about selecting elements. And I'm going to start at the very top of any HTML document. So as you know, that is the document. And so actually we do have a special way of selecting the entire document of any web page, so of any document. And that's document element. All right. So just document here is not enough to select the document element, because this is not the real DOM element. All right. So for example, if we want to apply CSS styles to the entire page, we always need to select document element. Okay. Let's just take a look here in the console. And so indeed, that is now the entire HTML here. Okay. And we can also easily select the head and body. So that's just head and dot body, as you can imagine. So this is not visible on the page, and the body is then also the entire kind of visible document. All right. So for these special elements, we don't even need to write any selector. But otherwise, as you already know, we can use query selector. So that's nothing new. For example, we can select the header element just like this, and this will then return the first element that matches this selector here. Now, if we want to select multiple elements, then we should use document.querySelectorAll. So again, we already used this one. And so here on this page, we have multiple elements with the section class. So basically each of these here are a section with the class of section. Okay. And I will actually store this here in a variable because I want to show you something a little bit later. Okay. But as you know already, this will return a node list, and then that will contain all of the elements that are a section, so that are selected by this selector. So these ones we have been using all the time, and in fact, they are the most used ways of selecting elements. Now, as you learned, hopefully from the previous lecture, these are available not only on the document here, like this, but also on all the elements, okay? And we actually use this a lot when we want to select child elements, as we will do a little bit later in this section, okay? Next, I think we also already talked about get element by ID. And so here we only pass the ID name itself without the selector. So this section here has the ID section 1. And so, yeah, we don't need the selector here. That's only for the query selector methods. All right. So I showed you this one because now there are also some others. So there are get elements, and that's elements, so with an S, by tag name. And so let's say we want to get all the buttons. So all the elements with the name of button, basically. So let's actually store this also, all buttons, and then log it to the console. Let's give it some more space here. And so here now you see all the buttons that are on our page. Now, what I wanted to show you is that this method actually returns an HTML collection. So that's different from a node list, because an HTML collection is actually a so-called live collection. And that means that if the DOM changes, then this collection is also immediately updated automatically. So for example, if I remove this button here, and I can do that by clicking inspect, and then that will select that button here, then all I need to do is to hit delete. And then if I go back here to the console and try to read the all buttons again, then you see that we only have 8 elements in here, while before we had 9, right? So that's something very important to keep in mind when you use this selector here, okay? And sometimes it's actually quite helpful to have an HTML collection like this, which updates automatically. Because of course, we can also delete elements from the DOM programmatically, not just manually, like I just deleted this button here earlier. All right. Now the same does not happen with a node list. So if I take this whole section here and delete it, and if I then try to read all the sections, then I still have the same 4 elements here in the node list. And that's because this variable here was created by the time that this section still existed. And it didn't update itself as I deleted one of its elements. All right. So again, that's important to keep in mind. Okay. And finally, I also want to show you get elements by class name. So this is similar again to get element by ID and get elements by tag name. So here we can now specify a class name. So let's say button. And once again, we don't need the selector. So it's not a dot, it's simply the name of the classes. And this one will also return a live HTML collection. So just as I explained you earlier. Okay, so this is how we select elements. Selecting elements. Once of these you already knew. So basically these 2 more modern ones, but these ones also have a place. So this one and this one, in case that you really need an HTML collection, which in some situations is useful, but most of the time I simply keep using query selector and query selector all. Okay. Next up, let's talk about creating and inserting elements. Now, we can create HTML elements using the insert adjacent HTML function that we used before in the Bankist application. Remember? So we used insert adjacent HTML to create movements, right? And this is a quick and easy way of creating elements that I really like a lot and use the most, actually. So please go back to the Bankist application and remember exactly how it works. All right. So I don't need to talk about this one here again, and I will instead focus on some other ways of creating elements, because sometimes it's more useful to actually build the element a bit more from scratch, like more programmatically using a combination of some other methods. So let's see how, and then it will all make sense. Okay, so let's use document.createElement. Okay, and then here we need to pass in the string of basically the tag name. So I want to create a div here now. And so this will return a DOM element that we can then save somewhere. And I'm calling this one message, and I will explain why in a second. Okay. So again, this here creates a DOM element and then stores that element into the message. Now that element is not yet anywhere in our DOM. All this is a DOM object that we can now use to do something on it, but it is not yet in the DOM itself. So it's nowhere to be found on our web page here. Okay, if we want it on the page, then we need to manually insert it into the page. But first, let's actually do something with it. So for example, we can add classes. And so now this is like any other selection that we have. Okay, so if we have an element in our DOM and select it, for example, using query selector here, like this, then the result is also a DOM object that we can use in our code. And this here is now just the same. It's just an object that represents a DOM element. And so, just like before, we can use, for example, class list on it. So class list, and then we can add, and I will add a class called cookie message. And that's because here we will now programmatically build an element which will display a small cookie message on the bottom of the screen. So I'm sure you've seen these on all web pages these days. They are quite annoying. So let me search here for cookie, and here you go. So this is the class that I created for this cookie message. And so this is the one we are adding now to our newly created element. Okay, let's get rid of this here. And now we can keep going. So for example, we can add text into the element. And as always, we do that using text content. So let's just say we use cookies for improved functionality and analytics, something like that. Analytics. Okay, so this inserts simply text, but of course we can also insert HTML. And so that is then inner HTML, which we also already used before. And remember that we can use both of these properties to read and to set content. Okay, and so here let's now write a string of HTML. So let's copy this, and then we can also like add a button. Okay, missing the colon here. So let's add a button element. Okay, so I'm just writing some HTML here. This doesn't matter, just copy this code. All right, it's just so that it will have the correct formatting then based on the CSS that I wrote before. So this will basically just display a nicely formatted button saying, got it. Okay, but anyway, we now have this element, and all we have to do now is to insert it into our DOM. And let's do that here in our header. So give it some more space. So all of this here is our header element. So this takes up so much space. Can't get rid of it for some reason. So all of this is our header. And so we can now select this header and then append our message to that element. And we already have that here. Let's call this the header. And now we can say header.prepend. And now, indeed, here it is. So here is our message. So maybe you saw it being added here. So indeed, it's now also really in our DOM. Now, for some reason, I think this doesn't look quite right. Well, maybe it does. So what matters here is that we just inserted this element really into our HTML. So right into our DOM. So prepending basically adds the element as the first child of this element. Okay, but we can also add it as the last child. And so that is append. So header.append message. And what happens now? So now we see that it's really appended. So it's the last child. So it's got to be, yeah, it's here. Now, what we see here is that the element was actually only inserted once. Now, that's because this element here, so message, is now indeed a live element living in the DOM. And so therefore, it cannot be at multiple places at the same time. It's just like a person that also cannot be at two places simultaneously, right? So what happened here is that we first prepended the element and then we appended it. And what this append did here was to basically move the element from being the first child to being the last child. All right. So basically it moved the element and didn't really insert it because it was already inserted here by prepend. So what this means is that we can use the prepend and append methods not only to insert elements, but also to move them. And again, that is because a DOM element is unique. So it can always only exist at one place at a time. But now, what if we actually wanted to insert multiple copies of the same element? Well, in that case, we actually would have to first copy the first element. So let's comment out this part here and say header.append. And then instead of appending the message directly, we first clone it. So that's clone node. And then we need to pass in true, or we can pass in true, which simply means that all the child elements will also be copied. And so now, as you see, we get the same cookie message in both places. But usually this is not what we want. So let's actually only append it. So having it here at the bottom where it makes the most sense. Now, to finish, there are actually two more methods, and that is before and after. And as the name says, this one will insert the message before the header element, so as a sibling, and this one here after the header element, so also as a sibling. Let's just get rid of this so we can see it here before. And so now it's actually really before the header. So first a cookie message and then the header, but they are siblings. And now the same here. It's now after the header. So we have the whole header and then we have this cookie element. All right. So that is how we create and insert elements programmatically. And now to finish, let's also delete elements. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to remove this element when we click this button. So let's select this button and then as we click it, remove the message. So document.querySelector, and we gave it the class of button close cookie, right? And then add event listener. And now all we have to do is message dot remove. And again, here we don't have to select the message element again because we already have it in memory. So we already have it stored in a variable. So there's no need to run a document.querySelector. Of course, we could do it, and it would work as well. So we could select the element with the class of cookie message. But again, that's not necessary because we already have it stored in memory. Okay, and so if I click this, then it's gone. All right, it's nowhere to be found now. Now, this remove method here is actually very recent. Before this method existed, all we could do was to remove child elements. And so back then, we had to select the parent element first and then remove the child from there. So that would look like this. So message, and then we would move up in the DOM tree, remove child. And then again, the name of the element that we want to remove. So this is a bit cumbersome, but again, this is how we used to do it. And I'm sure you will see this in some code bases because many people also don't yet know about this newer way of doing things. And by the way, this way of moving up and down in the DOM tree, like selecting the parent element, is called DOM traversing, and there is a whole lecture on that a bit later in this section. Let's just see if this works as well, and indeed it does. So this is how we select, create, insert, and delete elements. And to make this 100% complete, just make sure that you review the insert adjacent HTML method as well that we used before in the Bankist application. I promise that we're gonna start working on the project really soon. But for now, we need another reference lecture. So here we're gonna learn about styles and attributes and classes, and you will be able to keep all of the relevant tools here in one simple lecture so that you can reference all of them in the future. And some of these tools we will use later in a project, but it's impossible to create examples for all the functions and methods that I'm going to show you now. But they are still important. So let's go. And let's actually keep working on our cookies message banner here. Okay? So we're going to start by talking about styles. And we already set CSS styles before, but there are still some more things to learn. But first, let's go back to the basics. So to set a style on an element, we get the element, dot style, and then dot the property name. And remember, this will have to use the camel case version. So background color, and then a string with the value. And so here the color that I want is this one. So it's this kind of dark blue. So indeed, now this style nicely got applied to our element. And again, we didn't have to select it manually first because we already had it stored here in this message variable, which is this element that we created manually, right? We can also set the width, dot width, and remember that we have to write the CSS value exactly as we would do in CSS. And so we always have to include the unit. So in this case, I'm going to set it to a larger percentage so that it occupies this white gap here. And so now it got a little bit wider. Okay. And remember that these styles are actually set as inline styles. So styles set directly here in the DOM. So here in the style attribute of this element, we now have the background color and the width. Okay? And so these, again, are called inline styles. Now, you might think that we are able to also read styles using this. So using the style property. But let's see what's going to happen. So message.style, and let's say we want to get the height. So let's see what we get. And we get, well, basically nothing. And that's because using the style property like this here only works for inline styles that we set ourselves, also using the style property. So it's going to work, for example, for the background color. So let's copy this one. And now, here you actually get the background color. And again, because it is an inline style. So a style that we set manually ourselves. But we cannot get a style that is hidden inside of a class, or maybe that doesn't even exist. So for example here, let's say we wanted to get the color. So the color is defined in the style sheet, But if we try to log it here, then it's nowhere to be found. Now, we can still get the styles if we really want to. All we need to do is to use the getComputedStyle function. So that sounds a bit weird. And this is how it works. So getComputedStyle, and VS Code already suggests it here to me. And so here we need to pass in the element. So that's message. And now you see we get this huge object here. And so this contains all of the properties with all of the values. So this is huge. And so in practice, what we then do is to simply take a certain property like color from there. And so you see, this here is the color. Or let's say we wanted to height. And so this is the computed styles. So you see computed, which means that it's the real style as it appears here on the page. And even if we do not declare it in our CSS. So for example, the height, we didn't define ourselves, but the browser, of course, needed to calculate the height to display it. And so we can then get access to that value. And so you see it's this amount of pixels. So let's now say we wanted to increase the height of this message banner here by 40 pixels. So we could get this height and then simply add 40 to that. So let's create a variable called height. Or actually, let's do it directly. Let's say message.style.height should be equal to getComputedStyle.height plus 40, and then don't forget the unit. So 40 pixels. But now we're going to run into a problem, because as you see, this value here itself comes in pixels. So this here is a string, okay? Or actually all of this here, which is the same as we had before up here. So the result of this is a string. So here we're trying to add a number to a string, which of course is not going to work because, well, it has this pixel here. So let me show you that nothing here happened. But remember that we already learned about a nice function which can essentially take the number out of this string. So basically parse the number from here. And that is, remember, number.parse int or parse float. In this case, it's a floating point number. So let's use parse float here actually of this value. And then we need to specify also the number 10 in this function, remember? And so now it actually works. All right. So beautiful. It took that number here and only this number part without the pixels, added 40, and then added the pixel there. So that's a bit too much. So let's leave it like this. Okay, beautiful. So this getComputedStyle can become in really handy. But now finally, let's also work with CSS custom properties, which we usually just call CSS variables. So what I mean here is these variables that we have here. So all of these. They are called custom properties, but again, they are more like variables. And the idea of CSS variables is, of course, very similar to the idea of variables in JavaScript. So this way, we can change a value in many places all over our CSS files by simply changing the value here. Now, if we can change the value here, so here in our CSS, then we can also change it right from JavaScript. So let's go back here. Or actually, let's first see where these properties are defined. So they are defined in the document root. And so in JavaScript, that is equivalent to the document. So basically the document element. All right. So document.document element, as we learned in the last video. Okay. So that is the root that we just saw in CSS. And now again, style. But now we can do set property. Okay, and then the name of our custom property. So let's say we want to change our primary color. So color, primary, and then the value that we want to set it to. Let's say orange red. But of course, any color value would work here. And so you see that everywhere in our style where we used this color, which is a nice green color, now turned orange. So here, here, and really all over the place. All right. So with this, we can easily change the style of our page simply by setting one property. All right. So with custom properties, we cannot do it like this here, but instead we need to use set property. And then we pass in the name of the property and the value. And by the way, we can do the same for all properties. So we could also use set property to set the color or the background color or the width or really whatever we want. Okay, but usually it's just easier to simply do it like this. And that's why I always do that. Okay, so that's it for styles. Let's talk a little bit about attributes now. All right, so in HTML, just to remember, all of these are attributes. So this source, alt, even the class and the ID are simply attributes of this element. And so in JavaScript, we can of course access and change these different attributes. So let's actually select that logo that I just showed you. And the class of that is nav __ logo. So that's 2 underscores. And so now we can access some of these, let's say, default properties. So like the alt or the source attribute. So you see, here we get the alternative text, which is this alt, and then also the source. Now this looks a bit different than the one we have here, but more about that in a second. All right, so this works because on images, they are supposed to have the alt and the source attributes on them. And so if we specify them in HTML, then JavaScript will automatically create these properties on the object. Okay, but if we add some other property that is not a standard, then JavaScript will not automatically create a property on the object. So let's add, for example, designer and set it to Jonas. Okay, and so if we now tried to read logo.designer, that's not going to work. So you see, it's undefined. And again, that is because this is not a standard property that is expected to be on images. All right. Just another one that works here, and that's a bit different than you might expect, is class name. So the class name of this element is just this class. And so you might think that it should be just class, but for historical reasons, it has to be class name like this. Okay. So this is a non-standard, and that's why it doesn't work. Okay, at least it doesn't work like this, but of course there is another way of reading this value from the DOM. It's just a little bit more difficult, but it's not a problem. So we can use get attribute, and then here we can pass in the string designer, and that indeed it returns to us Jonas. All right. Now, just as we can read these values for these attributes, we can also set them. For example, we can say logo.the alt text should be beautiful minimalist logo. And so now let's check that out. And so indeed, that is the, well, that's actually the hero. So what I want is this. So yeah, it says beautiful minimalist logo now. All right. Oh, and by the way, there's also the opposite of get attribute, which is set attribute. So we can also say, for example, company, and then set it to Bankist. And so again, if we check it out now, then there should be this new attribute created right here. All right. Now, remember that I told you that the URL here, so basically, actually the source is different than what we have in the HTML. So this URL here of this image is basically the absolute URL, while what I have here, so this one here, is just the relative URL, so relative to the folder in which the index.html file is located. So that's completely different. And if we want to get just literally this URL that we have here, then we also have to use a get attribute. Okay? So get attribute and then src. So let me actually put these together so we can see the difference. And of course, I need to log this to the console as well. Okay, and so here you see the absolute version and then here the relative. So sometimes we really need the relative one, and then make sure you use this one. So get attribute. All right, so sometimes that's very important to keep in mind, and so that's why I showed it to you here. And the same is actually true for the href attribute on links. So where is the link? I think down here I have a Twitter link. So yeah, that's this one. So let's get this class here. So very quickly, just to show you, because on links, this is also sometimes very important. Query selector. So just so you can see what I mean here. So link.href and link.get attribute and then href again. Well, in this case, they're probably the same anyway. Yeah, because both of them were already absolute anyway. So in this case, that is not a big deal. But for example, in one of these links here in the top, there it might be relevant. Okay, so let's actually try that. So let's use this one. So the button show modal, so the nav link button, which here you see is simply this hash. So let's put that here. Oh, we're missing the dot. And now indeed you see that the href property is the absolute URL once again, while using get attribute simply returns the URL as I wrote it in the HTML. Okay. Finally, there is also a special type of attributes, and that's data attributes. So data. And data attributes are a special kind of attributes that start with the word data. So let's add one here to our image here. And let's say, so data version number equals 3.0. Okay. So again, it has to start with data. All right. And then dash and then whatever we want. Okay. And what's special about this is that now this attribute is at logo.dataset and then dot version number. And here that's dataset. Don't know where that came from. Okay. And so here we use camel case, where here we have the dash. Okay. So just like property names, we need to transform this here into camel case. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay? So for these special attributes, they are always stored in the dataset object. And indeed, then down here we have that 3.0. So we use actually data attributes quite a lot when we work with the UI, especially when we need to store data in the user interface. So basically in the HTML code. And we will see how useful that can be throughout the rest of this project and of the course. Finally, to finish this year, just to make it complete, let's talk about classes. And even though at this point we actually already know all there is to know about classes. So you know that there is logo.classlist.add, and I will not do anything here. So there is add, remove, there is toggle, and there is contains. Okay, so these are the four that you really need to know. And here apparently we need to pass in something. Maybe the empty string works, but I'm not sure. Well, apparently it doesn't. Let's just write some name here. Just C for class. Okay. And keep in mind that you can also add multiple classes by passing in multiple values. And of course, here I'm just writing completely fake class names just to make a point. Okay. Now, just as we could read the class name here using the class name property, we could also use that to set a class. So we could do logo dot class name and then set that, well, let's say to Jonas. Okay. However, don't use this. Don't use. Okay. Because this will override all the existing classes, while these four methods here make it really nice to work with the classes by simply allowing us to add and remove classes based on their names without interfering with the classes that are already there. Just keep in mind that this one here is really called contains and not includes like it is called in arrays. So I hope that this serves as a nice reference for all these different ways of working with classes, attributes, and styles in JavaScript. But now in the next lecture, let's finally start to work on our project here. Let's now start working on the Bankist website. And we're going to start by implementing smooth scrolling. And the functionality that we're going to implement now is when we click on this button, then it will smoothly scroll to this first section. Okay, so that's it. Simple effect. All that happens is one click, and the effect is that it smoothly scrolls here to this first section. So we're going to see two ways of doing this. First, one a bit more old school, which will allow me to show you a couple of interesting stuff. And then finally, I will show you the more modern way, which only works in super modern browsers. So let's start by selecting the button and the section that we want to scroll to. So that button is, it's this one, button scroll to, all right. And then the section is this one, section 1. So with this ID of section 1. So const button scroll to is document.query selector. All right. And now section 1 is document.query selector. And now it's the ID, so that's the hash, and then section --1. So that's the easy part. And now, as always, we need to start by adding an event listener to the button. .add event listener on click, and then our function. And let's actually give it the event. So in the first way that we're going to do, we need to first get the coordinates of the element that we want to scroll to. So let me show you how. So S1 chords, and that's section 1 dot get bounding client rect. All right, that sounds like a mouthful. It's actually pretty straightforward. Let me show it to you actually first. So when I click this, then we get this DOM rectangle. All right, and it has all of these properties. So the X position, which is measured from the left side, the Y position, which is measured from the top, and then the width of the element, the height, and then a lot of other properties. All right, and this element is probably not the best one to understand this. So let's get this rectangle for the button. So that's the element we just clicked. So e.target, remember, so e.target is essentially this element here, so the one that was clicked. And now get bounding client rectangle as well. And so let's take a look at that second one. So this 30 pixels here is the distance between the border here of the browser. All right, and then this Y is this distance from the top. Then we also have the width, which is this 112, the height, and yeah, here we also get the top, which is in this case similar to Y, okay, but it isn't always, because when we scroll, then X and Y actually change. Let me show that to you. And if I click this again now, then let's take a look here. So you see that Y is now only 168 pixels. And so that's the distance between this element and the top of this viewport. So this bounding client rect is basically relative to this visible viewport. All right. And in fact, we can also get the current scroll position. So since we're talking about scrolling, let me show that to you as well. So current scroll, so that's the X and the Y positions, just so we see what we are looking at. So these values are at window, page X offset, and page Y offset. So let me just scroll somewhere here, click this, and so we get that the current scroll is at 0 from X, so there's no horizontal scroll, and vertically we already scrolled 290 pixels here at this point. So when we're at the very top, then these two values should both be 0, and so yeah, now they are. So basically this Y coordinate here is the distance between the current position here of the viewport and the top of the page. So here at this line, for example, when we're here, if we get to scroll now, well, now we can't because we can't click on the button. But yeah, you get the point. So the distance, for example, here is now 421. So that means that from this very edge of the browser right now, all the way to the top of the page, it is 421 pixels. Okay? And sometimes that's very important to know in certain applications. And if you're even more curious, then since we're talking about coordinates and stuff, we can also read the height and the width of this viewport. So again, of this rectangle in which we can see the current portion of the page. So height and width of viewport, and they are at document.documentElement.client height, and then the same with client width. Client width. All right. So you see that this height here is 588 and the width 1067. So if I change this here, so this is kind of half now. So let's see what value we get now. And so now it is 276. Okay, And so that's because I decreased that visible box there. And so the height of the viewport is, of course, different. So let's reload here, click again. And so, yeah, here we get all kinds of interesting information about coordinates, scrolling, and dimensions of the viewport. All right. But anyway, the goal of actually getting these coordinates is because we need them to scroll to this first section here. All right. So basically, we need these coordinates here to tell JavaScript where it should scroll to. So let's now do that, actually. So scrolling, and we use window.scroll to. Okay. So that's a global function that's available on the window object. And here the first argument is the left position. And so that is at S1 chords. And let's take a look here. So this is the one. Oh, now it's gone. So we are interested here in this left value right now. So it is 0, and that's good because we don't want any horizontal scroll. Then for the second one, we're going to be interested in the top, which is, again, the position from the top of the viewport. So the section starts here, so it's basically these 270 pixels right there. Okay. So left and S1 chords dot top. So let's give it some more space and let's try it. And indeed, now it worked. So we are now here at the top of section 1. Okay. And so that's because the top was at 730 pixels. And so that's the distance that was scrolled. However, watch what happens when I click again. So now it doesn't really work, does it? Well, that's because this top here that we specified is always relative to the viewport, but not to the document. So not to the top of the page, basically. Right? So let me show it to you again. So it works when we are here. All right? And that's because this Y position here, which is the same as this top, is 429, which is basically the distance between this point and this point. Okay? But if we're doing it here, then the distance between the line and the top of the viewport here is a lot less. So it's only like 200 or something. So let's see. It is only, actually it's only 112. Well, that doesn't make sense. Well, actually, it's this one. So it's only 333. All right. And so basically it only scrolled to position 333, while in fact we wanted to scroll all the way to here, which was at something like, so it was at 492, or actually at 713. Okay, so I know it's all a little bit confusing, and in order to really understand all of these numbers, you have to play around with this a lot by yourself. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to make sense of this. But the solution to this problem is to simply add the current scroll position to the top value here. And with this, we will then determine the position of this section here, not relative to the viewport, so to the top of this browser window here, but instead to the top of the page. Okay? So again, the position of this section here is always this top, which is from here to the viewport, plus the current scroll position. And so that's the distance from here all the way to the top. Okay, so let's add that here. And again, to really make sense of all I'm saying here, please play around with this a lot by yourself. Okay, so page Y offset. And here it should actually also be window. And then we also, just for the sake of completeness, added here as well. So window.page x offset. Okay, so let's see if it still works here, and it does. And now let's try it from somewhere else, like here, and now it works. Now it goes to the correct place. And so by doing this here, we basically determined the absolute position of this element relative to the document, so to the entire page. And that's important to note. So if you need that, then this is how you calculate it. So again, the current position plus the current scroll. All right. Now we can even make this better. So dot scroll to again, because there is a way of making this animation nice and smooth. And this works by passing in an object now instead of just one argument. So let's get these two, and then let's comment all of this out. And so the properties that we need to specify are the left. So this is the left. This is the top. And so this is actually called top. And then we also have a property called behavior. And so here we can now specify smooth. All right. So to implement smooth scrolling like this, we need to specify an object with the left, top, and behavior properties. So let's try it out. And it works. Great. So that is a lot better, isn't it? And again, it also is going to work from this position. And the browser automatically figures out the speed it should go to make this look really nice. All right. So this is kind of the old school way still of doing it. So manually calculating all of these values here and then saying that we want to scroll to this position. All right. But there is a more modern way, and it works like this. We simply take the element that we want to scroll to, and that is section 1. And on that, we call scroll into view. And then we pass in an object and specify, again, behavior, and set it to smooth. And that's actually it. Then we don't need any of this. Okay, let me prove it to you. And it works just the same. So without any of these weird calculations here with these weird positions and all of that, it's all unnecessary if we are able to use this function here. And again, this only works in modern browsers, but if you only need to support these, then you are 100% fine using only this method. But I think it was still a good idea to show you all of these different numbers here. So like calculating the current scroll positions or the current window positions and sizes, and also all the sizes of the elements that we can get using this function. And by the way, these client height and width here are not counting with the scroll bars. It's just the dimensions of the viewport that are actually available for the content. And of course, that excludes any scroll bars. In this lecture and the next ones, we're going to talk a little bit more about events. Now, we already worked with events before, of course, but now let's add some more important concepts and also make things a bit more clear. So, an event is basically a signal that is generated by a certain DOM node. And a signal means that something has happened. For example, a click somewhere, or the mouse moving, or the user triggering the full screen mode, and really anything of importance that happens on our web page generates an event. And as we already know, we can then listen for these events in our code using event listeners, so that we can then handle them if we'd like. But no matter if we handle a certain event or not, for example a click, that event will always happen when a user clicks. So it doesn't matter if we're actually listening for it or not. All right? And that's going to be important to understand also in the next video. Now, we already worked with a couple of different events earlier in the course, but now let's take a look at another type of event, which is the mouse enter event. But let's start by selecting an element, and let's use the h1 element this time. So we have an h1, which is this here, and so let's just say document.querySelector h1, and now we can listen for that event. So we already know about this one, so add event listener, but in this video we're going to take a look at two more ways of listening for events. All right, but anyway, let's now use mouse enter as I said previously. So mouse enter, and then as always a function with an event. So the mouse enter event here is a little bit like the hover event in CSS. So it fires whenever a mouse enters a certain element. So just as the name says. So whenever that happens, let's create an alert which says add event listener, just so we know where this one is coming from. Great. You are reading the heading. Okay. And let's try it out now. And indeed, as we hovered over it, we got this alert. And if we do it again, it comes again. So that works just fine. Let's now actually take a look at a list of different events on MDN. Let's say JavaScript events. And yeah, this is what I was looking for. So this event reference. So let's take a look at some of the more important ones. So we see that we already used the click events. So where are they? So here, mouse events. So click, this is the one we have been using all the time. But this time we used mouse enter. And as you see, there's then also mouse leave, which is fired off when the mouse is moved off the element. And then you have all of these. And of course, you can take a look at this list here by yourself. And you see that there is all these different kinds of events that we can eventually learn how to respond to. But usually the most important ones are the ones related to mouse and the keyboard ones. Okay? But for example, there are also some for the clipboard and for full screen and for resizing the page and for when we scroll the page and so on and so forth. Okay? So here is the warning again. But anyway, let me now show you another way of attaching an event listener to an element. And that is by using the so-called onEvent property directly on the element. So for example, when we want to listen for mouse enter, there is a property called on mouse enter. And then we can simply set that property to this function. All right. So here, let's do that. Just to see. And so now we get, of course, the alert from before, but we should get a second alert as well. And indeed, here it is. Okay. And so actually for each of the events that we just saw in the table, there is one onEvent property like this one. For example, also on click. All right. However, this way of listening to events is a bit old school. So it used to be done like this in the old days, but now we usually always use add event listener. Okay, so I'm just showing you this in case you ever come across this way of listening for events. Now there are two ways why add event listener is better. And the first one is that it allows us to add multiple event listeners to the same event. So we could do this here again and simply change the function here. But if we did the same with this property, then the second function would basically simply override the first one. All right. So that's one advantage of add-event-listener. And the second one, even more important, is that we can actually remove an event handler in case we don't need it anymore. And this is something that we hadn't done before, but it's actually very simple and very useful from time to time. And to do that, first we need to export the function into a named function. So we cannot just write, for example, the same function and expect it to work. That's not going to work. So let's take this here out. And let's say alert h1 is this function. And then on h1, here I want to pass in that. Let's just comment out this one so it doesn't get in our way. And so let's see. And indeed, it still works. That was not on purpose, but we can now actually prevent that from happening. So after we listened for an event and then handled that event here in this function, we can then remove that event listener. So here we can say h1 and now remove event listener. And again, we have to say mouse enter and then the name of the function. And so this is why we had to export the function into its own function. All right. And so let's see. So indeed, we got this alert now. But if I now hover this again, then nothing happens. And that's because in the same event handler function, we also then removed the event listener. And so this makes it that we can only listen for the event once. So this is a nice pattern whenever you only want to listen to any event just once. But of course, this doesn't have to be in here. So you can remove the event listener at any place in our code. For example, we could remove it after a certain time has passed. So let's use setTimeout here and a simple arrow function. And let's say that after 3 seconds have passed, we want to remove the event listener. So now we get it. And right now, apparently 3 seconds have already passed. And so now it's gone. All right. So this is another pattern of removing the event listener. But of course, there are going to be other situations where this is helpful. Finally, there's also a third way of handling events, which is by using an HTML attribute. Now, this one should actually not be used, but just for the sake of curiosity, I'm going to show it to you here. So let's actually this time use the onClick, just so we have a different one. But so this is quite similar to what we did here before in the JavaScript with the on mouse enter. We're simply defining it directly in HTML. Then here, we basically specify a string, and then we say what we want to happen. So this is pretty weird, but well, this is kind of old school JavaScript from the early days. Alert. Okay, and so now when we click here, then we get HTML alert. All right. But anyway, we don't need to bother with this one, but I'm just going to leave it here for you as a reference. And so that's different ways of handling events and also how to remove event listeners in case we don't need them anymore. Next up, you will learn about the most important property of events, which is bubbling. So let's move on right to the next video. JavaScript events have a very important property. They have a so-called capturing phase and a bubbling phase. So what does that mean? Well, let's find out. So here we have a very simple HTML document along with a DOM tree, but only for the anchor element that's represented in red here. So here we can see exactly all the parent elements of that red anchor element. And that's because we're going to simulate what exactly happens with an event when someone clicks on that link. So maybe pause the video for a minute and analyze this structure here. But anyway, let's now say that a click happens on the link. And as we already know, the DOM then generates a click event right away. However, this event is actually not generated at the target element, so at the element where the event happened, in this case the click on the anchor element. Instead, the event is actually generated at the root of the document, so at the very top of the DOM tree. And from there, the so-called capturing phase happens, where the event then travels all the way down from the document root to the target element. And as the event travels down the tree, it will pass through every single parent element of the target element. So in our example here, the HTML element, the body element, the section, then the paragraph, until it finally reaches its target. As soon as the event reaches the target phase begins, where events can be handled right at the target. And as we already know, we do that with event listeners such as this one. So event listeners wait for a certain event to happen on a certain element, and as soon as the event occurs, it runs the attached callback function. In this example, it will simply create this alert window. All right? And again, this happens in the target phase. All right. Now, after reaching the target, the event then actually travels all the way up to the document root again, in the so-called bubbling phase. So we say that events bubble up from the target to the document root. And just like in the capturing phase, the event passes through all its parent elements. And really just the parents, so not through any sibling elements. So as an event travels down and up the tree, they pass through all the parent elements, but not through any sibling element. But now you might be wondering, why is this so important? Why are we learning about all this detail? Well, it is indeed very important because basically it's as if the event also happened in each of the parent elements. So again, as the event bubbles through a parent element, it's as if the event had happened right in that very element. What this means is that if we attach the same event listener also, for example, to the section element, then we would get the exact same alert window for the section element as well. So we would have handled the exact same event twice, once at its target and once at one of its parent elements. And this behavior will allow us to implement really powerful patterns, as we will see throughout the rest of this section. So this really is very, very important to understand. Now, by default, events can only be handled in the target and in the bubbling phase. However, we can set up event listeners in a way that they listen to events in the capturing phase instead. Also, actually, not all types of events do have a capturing and bubbling phase. Some of them are created right on the target element, and so we can only handle them there. But really, most of the events do capture and bubble, such as I described it here in this lecture. We can also say that events propagate, which is really what capturing and bubbling is. It's events propagating from one place to another. All right, so I hope that all of this made sense, and so let's now actually see this in action in the next video. So let's now see event propagation in practice, and mainly event bubbling. And we're going to do that by attaching event handlers to this navigation link here, and also all of its parent elements. Then, as we click this link, we will give all these elements random background colors And this will then allow us to visualize exactly how event bubbling is happening. And it will make sense once you see it actually working. And let's actually start by creating that random color that I just mentioned. And the random color is basically just a string like RGB, and then with a value between 0 and 255. So here with commas, actually. And so you see that VS Code is already showing this as a color. So let's start with the random number generator. And this one I will simply write now because we already did it in the previous section. So that's going to be math.floor. So maybe I could have just copied this code here, but then it would appear that this code simply magically appears, and I don't really like that when I'm watching a tutorial myself. Okay, so this was the formula that we used before to generate a random integer, and now we can use that to create a random color. So random color, and let's use another arrow function here. And so now we simply need to follow this formula here. So here we need random int, and as I said, with a value between 0 and 255. So this, and then 3 times. Okay, and that's it. Let's just check it out. 255. Oh, that's not what I wanted. So you see that random colors keep appearing down there now. Okay, but now let's actually attach the event handlers that I was mentioning. So I want to attach an event handler to this link and then to the parent elements as well. So let's check our HTML. And so the link itself is the nav link. And then let's attach an event handler also to nav links. So that's going to be this entire header there. Let me actually show it to you here. So I'm going to use this link here. So you see it's appearing in blue up there. So this link, then this whole element, and then also this entire header here. So that's with the class of nav. So document.query selector. And here we are actually going to need the event. And then as always, just to see if it works. And it does. So let's now grab some of these others. So there's links and nav. Remember, so that's the 3 that we want to use here. And so anyone that we click now, we will see link. So for now, that doesn't really matter, because what I want to show you now is what happens when we assign a random background color to first starting with this one. So we can say this, and remember that in an event handler, the this keyword points always to the element on which that event handler is attached. So in this case, that's going to be this link. All right. So we say this dot style dot background color and set it equal to a random color. And for now, let's just get rid of these here just to see if this works. Oh, and now we see this is jumping around, and that's because of this hash there. So let me get rid of this for now. And this here as well. And now as we click, it reloads the page. So what we need here is this, I guess. And so yeah, now it works. And so as we click here, we see that the color of this element keeps changing. But now, what if we perform the exact same action on the parent element? So let's copy this and put it here. And again, keep in mind that this nav_links element is the parent of this link. So it's all of this block here. So when I click this link now here, what do you think is going to happen to the nav_links element? So to that whole container? Well, let's see. And you see that the container also got its own random background color. So based on what we learned in the last video, why do you think this is happening? Well, just as we learned before, the event actually happens at the document root, and from there it then travels down to the target element. And so in this case, that is this link. And then from there it bubbles up. And bubbling up means that basically it's as if the event had also happened in all of the parent elements. And so that is the reason why this exact event is now also being handled by this event listener here that is on nav_links. Okay? So again, it is as if the click event here on this link had also happened right here in this element. So in the nav_links element. All right? So both of these handlers here are now handling the same event which happened here on this link. And as we keep clicking, of course, the same keeps happening. Now, what do you think happens when we click only outside here? So only in the nav_links? Well, let's see. So you see that the color on the link itself keeps unchanged. And that's because this is the parent element. And so from here, the event only bubbles up to its parent elements. So let's see what happens when we actually also paste this here into this whole nav bar. So let's see. And indeed, now the click event that happened here was indeed handled in all three places. So in all three elements which have a click event handler. Great. But let's now dig a little bit deeper and talk about the event target. So here let me log to the console. First saying that this is the link, and then event.target. And the target is essentially where the event originated. So where the event first happened. So this is not the element on which the handler is actually attached. Okay? So again, this is where the event happened. So in this case, where the click happened. And it is not the element on which the event handler was attached. So let me put the same here also. And let's call this one here the container and the nav. Okay. And now watch what happens again when I click on this link. Okay. So one more time, all the three elements got a random background color. And you see that the target, which is this one here, is always the same. Okay. So in all three handlers, the target element will always be the same. And that's, of course, the element where the click first happened. And it appears in all the three handlers because all of them are essentially handling the exact same event. So this E here, so this event that each of them receives, is indeed the exact same event. And again, that is because of event bubbling. So the event originates here in this link, but then it bubbles up to its parent element, which is this one, and from there to its next parent element. And from there, it will travel even further up in the DOM tree. And so we can then handle that event in all of the parent elements. And that is exactly what we did here. All right. Now, besides the target, there's actually also the current target. So let me log that here as well. And the current target is indeed the element on which the event handler is attached. So e.currentTarget, and here e.currentTarget. So if we do this now, then you will see that the current target is not the same. Well, in the link it is, of course, because that's where the event happened, and it's also where the handler is attached to. But then here, it is, of course, the nav links, so the container, and here the whole navigation element. All right, and so you might have noticed that the current target is exactly the same as the this keyword, right? So the this keyword is also the one pointing to the element on which the event listener is attached to, so such as we used here. And all of this is important to know when you really want to gain a deep understanding of the DOM and how it works. So here you see we got indeed true. So the this keyword and event.currentTarget are going to be exactly the same in any event handler. Another thing that I wanted to show you is that we can actually stop the event propagation. So let me show that to you. Propagation. And so all we have to do is to simply call on the event stop propagation. And that's it. So when we try to do the same thing now, watch what happens. So now the two parent elements did not change their background colors, which means that the event never arrived at those elements, right? That's why they weren't handled there. And again, that is because we stopped the propagation right here, okay? And so the propagation phase then never happened for this event. And therefore, these events never reached this element and also not this element. All right. Now, in practice, that's usually not a good idea to stop propagation, but I still showed it to you here in case you really need it sometime. So stopping the event propagation like this can sometimes fix problems in very complex applications with many handlers for the same events. But in general, it's not really a good idea to stop the propagation of events. So as we just saw, these three event handlers that we set up here receive events from the target elements and also from the bubbling phase, right? So in other words, the event handler functions are listening for click events that happen on the element itself, like this, right? Or like this. And where now, of course, only the background color of this one changes. And they're also listening for events that keep bubbling up from their child elements. And that's the reason why the color changes in all of the parent elements here as well. So the two phases that I just described are phase 2 and phase 3 in the slide that we saw in the last video, right? But now, what about the capture phase? So that was phase 1. Well, as we learned, events are captured when they come down from the document root all the way to the target. But our event handlers are not picking up these events during the capture phase. Remember that? So I mentioned that add_event_listener here is only listening for events in the bubbling phase, but not in the capturing phase. So that is the default behavior of the add_event_listener method. And the reason for that is that the capturing phase is usually irrelevant for us. It's just not that useful. Now, on the other hand, the bubbling phase can be very useful for something called event delegation. So that's something that we're going to do in the next lecture. However, if we really do want to catch events during the capturing phase, we can define a third parameter in the add_event_listener function. So, for example, here, we can set the third parameter to true or false. And so let's set it to true. And so in this case, where this useCapture parameter is set to true, the event handler will no longer listen to bubbling events, but instead to capturing events. Now in practice, that's going to look the same here. Okay, but as we take a look here in our log, you will see that now the nav is actually the first appearing. And let's clear that here and see it again. So you see that now the first element through which the event passes is the navigation. And the reason for that is that this element is now actually listening for the event as it travels down from the DOM, while these other ones are listening for the event as it travels back up. And so that happens later, and therefore the nav is now the first one to show up, because this of course is the first one to happen. Because first the event travels down all the way to the target, and only then it bubbles back up. And so these other two event handlers here, they are looking for bubbling events, and so therefore they are going to happen after this first one. Now they're still all working with the same event, they're simply doing it in different phases of the event propagation. And if that sounds confusing, then please take another look at the slide that I showed you in the last video. You can imagine that slide maybe with these elements that we're working with here, and then picture the event traveling down and up again, and how we capture it here in the capturing phase. So with this flag here set to true. So I hope that made sense, but let's now actually get rid of this. So by default, this is set to false, and so getting rid of this is the same as setting this argument to false. So as I said, capturing is actually rarely used these days. And the only reason why both capturing and bubbling actually exist is only for historical reasons. So from the time where different browsers implemented different versions of JavaScript. But anyway, what really matters that you really understand here is that why these three boxes here get three different background colors, even though the click only happened on this element. And I think I made that really clear in this video and also in the last one. Let's now use the power of event bubbling to implement something called event delegation. So what we're going to do is to implement a smooth scrolling behavior in the navigation, so that when we click one of these links here, it will then automatically scroll smoothly to the corresponding section. All right. So right now, as we click one of these links, it actually moves there, but of course we want this to happen smoothly. And so let's now go ahead and use event delegation to implement this navigation. And actually let's do that here at the top of the file. So here in the beginning, I will have all the code that is actually really related to the page, while down here we then have the code that we have been using to experiment with some stuff. All right. So page navigation comes right here after the model window. Let's grab this separator code here. And in fact, we can also put this code here, which was for scrolling. So this code, we also need it active in order to make this button here work, right? So let's put that actually here second. And okay. This here. All right. And these selections, I will put all of them here at the top. All right. So that's a little bit of a nicer organization, having, just like in the last project, all of the selection in one nice line. All right. Now we get this error here that button scroll to has already been declared. Oh, and that's because we actually wanted to cut this code. So we no longer want it here. Okay, so with this, we cleaned it up a little bit. And so let's now go actually to the place in code where we want to implement the page navigation. Now let's actually first implement this without using event delegation so that you can see the problem in the approach that we've been using so far. And so let's now select all of these 3 links here. So document.query selector, and actually it's got to be query selector all. And then, as we already saw in the previous video, they are called nav __ a link. Okay, so this will return a node list, and now we can use the for each method in order to attach an event handler to each of the elements that are in the node list. So actually just as we did up here, right? Okay, so for each, and so our callback function here, which gets access to the current element in the node list. And so to each element, let's now use the add event listener method. So a click, and then another callback function. So now we have callback inside of callback, but that's not a problem at all. All right, so here we again want access to the event. And now let's just start by logging to console link just like this. So indeed we get link here and on this one and also on this one. So 3 times link. Now you already start to see the problem, which is that by default, clicking one of these links will scroll to the position in the HTML. And that's because of these so-called anchors. Let me show it to you in the HTML. And so these here are called anchors. So hash and then some name here will automatically move the page to the element which has the ID of this. So let's see, down here we have, here we have this section with the ID section 2. And so as we click here then, it will automatically move to exactly that section. And we can see it here also in the URL bar, right? So we basically need to prevent that from happening. Let me just put this back here because in the last lecture, we deleted this section 1 that was here. And so as I was saying, we need to prevent this default behavior. And so for that, we use once more event, or E in this case, dot prevent default. And so let's see now. And indeed, now nothing happens. So we no longer scroll to the page, and you see that the URL bar is actually also no longer changing as we click here. So that problem is fixed. And so now let's implement the smooth navigation, or the smooth scrolling actually. Because if we didn't want the scrolling to be smooth, then we actually wouldn't need any of this, because we already saw that the browser will actually automatically move to that place, so to that anchor that we defined in HTML. Now, that anchor, however, so basically this part here is still going to be very useful, because we can now take this href attribute. So basically we can take this value here and select the element that we want to scroll to based on this. Because if we think about this, this actually looks pretty much like a selector for an ID, right? So let me write the code here, and then I will explain a little bit more. So let's get that href actually, and I'm going to call it ID. So that is at this, which is the current element, remember, dot get attribute, and then the href. Okay, and I used the get attribute function here because, as we learned before, I actually only want that part that we literally write here. So I don't want the absolute URL, and so that's why I cannot write simply this dot href. Remember that? Anyway, let's now log this to the console to see again what we're doing here. And so you see we get now section 1 here, 2 and 3. And now, as I was saying before, this here looks pretty much like a selector already. And so we can now take this and select an element based on this, and then simply scroll to that element. So for that, we're going to use the scroll into view method here again. So let me show that to you. So document.querySelector, and now all I need to pass in is this ID, right? Because again, this exact string that we get from the href attribute is already the perfect selector, so we can just use that. Okay? And so this is a pretty common technique that we use for implementing a navigation like this. So we put the ID of the element that we want to scroll to here in the href attribute, so that then in the JavaScript we can read that. So we can read that href, and then we can select the element that we want to scroll to. So in this case, it's the element with the ID section 1. And that is exactly this one here. So exactly the first section. All right. So here we have the element now selected, and now all we need is to call scroll into view, and then with behavior set to smooth, just like we did already here before. Okay, and that's actually already it. So that worked beautifully, right? All right, and now the third one, and here we go. Well, that didn't really scroll to where I thought it should go. But now it did. Apparently, something weird happened there, but that's not a problem. Now, as you see, this actually works just fine, but the problem is that it's not really efficient. So we are adding here the exact same callback function. So this event handler here, we are adding it once to each of these 3 elements. So the exact same function is now attached to these 3 elements. And that's kind of unnecessary. I mean, of course, it would be fine for only 3 elements, but what if we had 1,000 or like 10,000 elements? If we would attach an event handler to 10,000 elements like this, so like we did here with the for each function, then we would effectively be creating 10,000 copies of this same function here. And so that would then certainly impact the performance. And it's really just not a clean solution in that case. And so the better solution, without a doubt, is to use event delegation. So in event delegation, we use the fact that events bubble up. And we do that by putting the event listener on a common parent of all the elements that we are interested in. And so in our example, it's this container that's around all of these links that we saw in the previous video. So remember, that is this element here. So we will put our event handler on this element here, and then when a user clicks one of the links, the event is generated and bubbles up just as we saw in the last video. And then we can basically catch that event in this common parent element and handle it there, because we also know where the event actually originated, right? So we can figure that out by looking at the event.target property. So that's what event delegation is. And so let's now go ahead and implement it. All right. So in event delegation, we basically need 2 steps. First, we add the event listener to a common parent element of all the elements that we're interested in. So let me actually write that here, because this is a really important technique. So as I said, add event listener to common parent element. And then in that event listener, determine what element originated the event, so that we can then work with that element where the event was actually created. So let's do that. document.query selector. And so remember, the common element of all these links is nav links. So again, it's this. Yeah, it's this element. And so this is where we add the event listener. And now we just need to figure out where the event actually happened. And remember that that is stored in event.target, right? So event.target becomes really, really useful now in this strategy, because we can now use this information exactly to basically see where that event happened. So as I click here, we can now see well, that the event occurred from this element. And as we click here, then we see that it originated, of course, from this one. Okay? And as we click somewhere here in the middle, then we see that the click, of course, happened in this entire element, not in one of the links. And this part is actually important to notice, because now we actually only want to work with the clicks that happened on one of the links. So only this one or this one, but the click that happens here on this navlinks element is not relevant at all. And so now we need a matching strategy here in order to match only the elements that we are actually interested in. All right. And in this case, the best way to do that is to simply check if the target has this navlink class. All right. So this is the matching strategy. And this can sometimes be one of the hardest things to come up when you use this technique. But many times I actually do it like this. So I check if the target element contains the class that we are interested in. So class list, and then remember we can use the contains method. And then we can simply check if it contains the class navlink. And so that's then this one here, right? And only if it does, then let's log link. So let's see. So as we click, we get link, you see? Or another one, and we also get link. But then as we click somewhere else, like here in the middle, then we do not get link. All right? And so now we successfully basically only selected the link elements itself. And so now we can basically do exactly what we did here before. So we actually also need to prevent the default. And so let's get all of this. And replace that here. Get rid of the comments. And this one here, so preventing the default, we actually always want that, or to do that. So no matter where we are clicking, nothing should happen. All right. So let's try that. Oh, and here we get this error, and we get null on line 87. So that's this. Oh, and of course, we still have a problem here, because the href attribute is now not on this, but it is on the element that was clicked. And so that is again e.target. So that's the whole reason why we're using e.target in the first place. So let's try now. And beautiful. Now it actually works. So you see, we still get the same sections here also logged to the console, and it scrolls to exactly where we want it to go. Awesome. So this works beautifully, and yeah, we successfully implemented event delegation, which is a lot better and a lot more efficient than simply attaching the same event handler to multiple elements. Instead, we simply added one big event handler function to the parent element of all the elements that we're interested in, and then we simply determined where the click event came from. And then we also needed this matching strategy because we wanted to basically ignore clicks that did not happen right on one of these links. And coming up with this matching strategy, as I like to call it, is probably the hardest part of implementing event delegation. But don't worry, because there will be plenty of examples throughout the rest of the course. And so at some point, it will all make a lot of sense to you. So I hope that you're convinced that event delegation is a much better strategy, even though it requires a little bit more work than the first implementation that we did. And in fact, there is actually an even more important use case of event delegation, which is when we are working with elements that are not yet on the page on runtime, so by the time the page loads. And a great example are buttons that are added dynamically while using the application. So it's not possible to add event handlers onto elements that do not exist. But we will still be able to handle events on elements that don't exist at the beginning by using event delegation one more time. And we will actually do this later in this section. This lecture is going to be about traversing the DOM. So DOM traversing is basically walking through the DOM, which means that we can select an element based on another element. And this is very important because sometimes we need to select elements relative to a certain other element. For example, a direct child or a direct parent element. Or sometimes we don't even know the structure of the DOM at runtime. And in all these cases, we need DOM traversing. And this video is going to be another very nice reference lecture for you. And so let's now work with this H1 element here. And from here, we're going to go downwards, upwards, and also sideways. So let's quickly inspect this element. All right. So we see, so here we have the H1 element, and in there we have some text, we have some comments, then we have this span element, then some more text, and even more elements. And so this is going to be a lot of fun exploring a couple of different methods and properties to walk around this element. So let's start by selecting it. Maybe we already did that before somewhere, but that doesn't really matter. So let's start with going downwards. So basically selecting child elements. So the first way of doing that is to use query selector, because we already know that query selector also works on elements, not only on the document. So let's simply log to the console h1.querySelector, and then let's again see here what we could select. So we have this class highlight and this class highlight. So that's these two green ones. And so let's select them here. So that's actually query selector all, because there are two of them. And so class highlight. So let's take a look. And indeed, here they are. So this here indeed selects all the elements with the highlight class that are children of the H1 element. And that would work no matter how deep these child elements would be inside of the H1 element. Okay, and that's very important to notice. All right. Now in this case, these two elements here are direct children of the H1, but as I said, it would go down as deep as necessary into the DOM tree. Okay? And also, if there were other highlight elements on the page, so elements with this class, they would not get selected, because they would not be children of the H1 element. All right? So these are 2 points that are important to note here about query selector and query selector all. Now, sometimes all we need are actually direct children. And so for that, we can use h1.childNodes. So let's take a look. And so here we actually get all kinds of stuff. So we get text, we get a comment, and we get then these elements. And that's because we already know that nodes can be anything. So they can be text or elements or even comments as we have here. Okay, so this really gives us every single node of every single type that there exists. But many times we are simply interested in the elements themselves, right? So if we wanted the text, we could use .textContent or .innerHTML. So child nodes is not that used, but instead we can use children, just like this. And this then gives us an HTML collection, which remembers is a live collection, so it's updated. And so here we indeed only get the 3 elements that are actually inside of the H1. So that's this span, this breaking, and this span again. All right, but this one works only for direct children, so keep that in mind. Okay, finally, there's also first and last element child. So these names are a little bit confusing, but one more time, that's because of the messy nature of JavaScript with all of these things being implemented at different points in time, and so therefore it was difficult to keep consistent naming conventions. But anyway, let's use first element child, and so here it already is, style.color, just so that I can show you that we can actually also set these properties or use them to set something like the style. So for example, we can do this, and then only the first child here gets now this color set to white. So basically that's this element here, which is the first element here of all the children. That's why it's called first element child. And we can of course do also last element child, and let's say this one to black. So it's a little bit different now. It used to be, let's say, orange red. I really like this one, and so now it looks a little bit more crazy. Okay, but now let's go upwards. So going upwards, so basically selecting parents. And for direct parents, it's actually very straightforward. So here we have h1.parent node. And so that one is similar to child nodes. So let's see. And so it's this header title. So as we open this up, we see that indeed this h1 here is inside of header title. And so this is the direct parent. And so that's why we get this. Then there's also the parent element, which is usually the one that we are interested in. But in this case, it's simply the same. All right, because this element is also a node in this case. All right. However, most of the time, we actually need a parent element which is not a direct parent. Or in other words, we might need to find a parent element no matter how far away it is in the DOM tree. And for that, we have the closest method. So that's h1.closest. So let's say that on the page we had multiple headers, so multiple elements with the class of header. But for some reason, we only wanted to find the one that is a parent element of h1, so of our h1 element here. And so for that, we can use closest. And so the closest method receives a query string just like query selector and query selector all. All right. So dot header, and then let's do something with it. For example, change the background image, or just change the background. And I will set it here now actually to a CSS variable. So let me show that to you. So here we have all of these CSS variables, or as they are officially called, custom properties. And we use them in CSS by doing this. So by writing variable and then a color. And so, well, let's actually use a gradient. So gradient, yeah, so this one. Okay. just so you can see that we can use custom properties also in CSS. So give it a save, and beautiful. Well, it's not that beautiful, I must say, but indeed it worked. So it selected the closest header to our h1 element, so the closest parent element that has this class, and then it simply applied our style to that element. So this is a very important one, and we're going to use it all the time, especially for event delegation. So take a note of that, or just keep it in mind. Now, if this selector here actually matches the element on which we're calling closest, then that's actually the element that's going to be returned. So let me also show that. So we are calling this on the h1 element. And so if we're looking for the closest h1, then that's going to be exactly the element itself. And so, as I just said, then that's going to be the one that will be returned. Let's make this a bit more prominent here. And so you see that indeed, now this is the h1 element itself. So we can think of closest here as basically being the opposite of query selector. So both receive a query string as an input, but query selector finds children no matter how deep in the DOM tree, while the closest method finds parents, and also no matter how far up in the DOM tree. All right. So very important method here to keep in mind. And now let's go sideways. So selecting siblings. And for some reason in JavaScript, we can only access direct siblings. So basically only the previous and the next one. So that's h1.previous element sibling, like this. And then there's also the next element sibling. All right. So the previous element sibling is null. And so if we take a look at that, it makes sense because there is nothing there. So this is the first child of this parent element, and therefore it doesn't have a previous sibling, but it has a next sibling. And so that's this h4 element, which comes after it. And just like before, we also have the same methods, or actually the same properties for nodes. So that's just previous sibling and next sibling. So let's see. And here the previous sibling is now actually text. So not sure what that is. Well, it's not really important because again, most of the time we're going to be working with the elements anyway. Now, if we really need all the siblings and not just the previous and the next one, then we can use the trick of moving up to the parent element and then read all the children from there. So let's see. So h1 dot parent element. So that's just like we learned before. So the direct parent, and then from there we can get all the children. So just like we learned here also before. So dot children. And so now we get all of the siblings. And that of course is going to include itself. So that's all of these elements, and all of them are siblings. And just for fun, let's actually do something with them here. So this is an HTML collection, remember, so it's one more time not an array, but it is still an iterable that we can spread into an array. So we can do this, and it will then create an array from this. And then we can loop over that array and do something using the for each method. So let's say that we wanted to change some style to all the siblings, but except the element itself. And actually that's more straightforward than you might imagine. So we can simply do this here. So we can check if the element is different or equal also works than the h1. Because h1 is our original element itself. And so comparisons between elements actually work just fine. Okay, And so when the element is not the h1 itself, then let's change the style. And let's say we want the transform property just to scale them a little bit. Let's say 0.5. So scaling them by 50%. And indeed, all the other three siblings are now like 50% smaller. All right. And so this is how we can work with all the sibling elements of one element. Great. And that's actually the fundamentals of DOM traversing. And we're going to need them all the time, and especially when we're doing some more complex event delegation like we will do throughout the rest of this section. In this video, we're going to implement a very popular component, which is a tabbed component. And you will see tabbed components on many websites these days, so it's great to learn how to build one yourself. So the component that we're going to build in this video is this one. Now, a tabbed component can appear in many different ways, but what they all have in common is that they have some kind of tabs, like these here, and when you click the tab, then the content of this area below will change. And so that's exactly what happens here with these buttons. So basically these three are our tabs, and then as we click on one of the tabs, it will reveal the associated content. So a little bit like tabs here in our browser, right? So each browser tab has its own web page, and so here each tab has its own content area, basically. So I'm sure you've seen this on other websites, and so let's now go ahead and implement this ourselves. Okay. Now, for this component, we actually need a bunch of HTML. So let's first take a look at that. So the whole tabbed component in our case is called operations. So let's scroll down here also. And so this section here is about the operations we can do on a bank account, and therefore this component here is called operations. And you can also see that here on the page. Then we have the tab container, basically. So that's this element. And so you can also see it here again, and it's the element which will contain the three tabs. And so each tab is itself a button, and it has this class of operations tab. Okay. Then below that, we have the content. And in fact, we have three contents. So we have one content element here for each of the tabs. All right. So the first one here, as you see, is called operations content 1. Then the other one is operations content 2 and operations content 3. So as we click on one of these tabs, we will not create any new content. What we will do instead is to hide the other tabs, basically. So you see that right now, this first one here has the operations content active class. And so therefore this one is visible and all the others are hidden. And what's also important here is that these buttons here, they have this data tab attribute. And so this one is number 1, and this will then be associated with this class name here. So operations content and then again 1. But more about that in a minute when we actually implement this ourselves. So for now, we just need to get down the basic structure of the HTML here. And it might be a good idea for you to pause the video and take a minute or two to get yourself familiar with this HTML structure and all of the class names that are involved here. Okay, and you can even take a look at the CSS, because there's also a lot of CSS involved here. All right, so of course I couldn't write all of this code here together with you now, because that would take way too long. All right, but anyway, let's now build this tabbed component here. And we're going to start by selecting the tabs. Okay, and I will keep the elements here open so we can see it at all time. And so you see that the buttons, they have the class operations tab. So tabs equal document.querySelector all, and then with the class operations tab. Then let's also select the tabs container and so that is this element here. Let's actually go ahead and copy it. And finally, also the 3 content areas. So that's here, operations content. You see, cannot copy it for some reason. Doesn't matter. So tabs content is document.querySelector all. So because again, we have 3 of them. All right. So we have our selections nicely done. And now we can actually work on the functionality. And let's start by adding event handlers to these buttons here, right? Because that is the action that we actually want to handle in this component. So we could do it like this. So taking all the tabs, and then on each of them, we could attach an event handler. So for example, like this. So for each, because we want to do it on each of them, so we get then each tab, and then tab.add event listener, click, and let's just use a quick arrow function here, because this is really just a demonstration. Well, nothing happens. Let's try to reload this page. Yeah, indeed. Now we get the tab locked to the console. Now, however, as we already learned in the last video, doing this here is a bad practice. Because what if we had like 200 tabs? Then we would have 200 copies of this exact callback function here, and that would simply slow down the page. So that's not at all desirable. And so let's get rid of this and one more time use event delegation. And remember that for event delegation, we need to attach the event handler on the common parent element of all the elements that we're interested in. And in our case, that is this tabs container, right? So we have our buttons here. So right here, our buttons, and the common parent of all of them is this tab container that we already selected previously. And so let's attach our event handler to that element instead. So tabs container.add event listener, click. We need the event, of course, so that we can figure out where the click happened. And so let's now actually work on our matching strategy. Okay, so we already know that we are interested in the buttons. And so let's now figure out which button was clicked. So let's actually create an element called clicked that we can then use to work with. And so what about this? So what about simply using the e.target? Well, let's see. So in our console, let's now click somewhere here. And indeed, now we got the button that was clicked. Okay. However, there is a problem when we click here on this number. So you see that now we did not get a button, but we got this span element. And that's because inside of this button, we actually have another element. And so now, even though it looked like we clicked on the button here, or here, for example, actually we are clicking on this span element, right? So we are not actually clicking on the button, but we still need the button. So no matter if we click on this button itself or here on the span element, we actually need the button element itself, because from that button, we will need to read this data tab attribute here. Because as I mentioned earlier, this one contains the number of the tab that should become visible. And so here, this data attribute becomes really important to store information in the DOM. So basically, we need a way of finding the button element whenever we click on this span element, right? Now, one simple way to fix it, which would not really fix it actually, is to do some DOM traversing and simply select the parent element. We can move up the DOM tree, and instead of simply taking e.target, we can use the parent element of that. So let's see what happens then. And so now indeed, when we click on the number, we get the button. And so again, that's because that is the parent element of that span. Now the problem appears when we click on the button itself, because now of course we will also get the parent of the button element. And so that is this container. But of course that is not what we want. So basically what we want is to get the button no matter if we click here on the span or on the button itself. So we need a way of selecting the parent element that is always a tab. And can you think of a special method that we learned previously to do that? Well, the solution is right here in the previous video. Well, and that's down here somewhere. So remember that we want a way of going upwards, but we want to specify that we want to select an operations tab. And so we can use this closest method for exactly that. So remember that I said that this method is going to be really helpful in event delegation. And so now that's actually the case. Okay, so this method makes it really easy for us to dynamically get the element that we're interested in. So here, instead of always selecting the parent element, we will search basically for the closest operations tab. And so here we need the exact same query as that. All right, and this should actually now fix our problem. So let's see. When we click the button itself, then we get the button. And when we click the number here, so the span, then we also get the button, because now it finds the closest parent with this class name, which indeed is the button itself, so the tab. And here we get the tab number 2, as you can see down here. And here we get tab number 3. Great. And let's actually immediately do something with this selected tab. So the tab that is currently active here has a different style, as you can see. So it's a bit moved up. And so that's because the active tab basically has this class. So where's that? It has this class of operations tab active. All right. So we can simply add that to the element that was just clicked. So class list dot add operations tab active. Okay. And now as we click, you see that it activates basically this tab. Now, of course, later, then all the other tabs will have to move down, but we're going to take care of that in a second. Because now watch what happens when we actually click on the tabs container itself. So outside of any of the buttons, but still in the tabs container where this event listener is actually attached to. So you see that we get null here. And that's because null is the result of the closest method here when there is no matching parent element to be found. So of course, when we click here in this tabs container, then there's going to be no parent with this class. And so therefore, as I just said, we get null. And so we need to fix that now in our code and basically ignore any clicks that happen on that area. So basically ignore any clicks where the result is then null. All right. So we can do that by saying if there is no clicked, then return immediately. And this is something that we haven't done before. So what I'm doing here is called a guard clause. So it's basically an if statement which will return early if some condition is matched. So in this case, when there's nothing clicked, then we want to immediately finish this function. And in this case, when we have null, which is a falsy value, then not falsy will become true, and then the function will return, and none of the code that's after it will be executed. But of course, if clicked does exist, then this return will not be executed, and the rest of the code will be executed just fine. So this is a more modern way of writing this. So we could have written instead also, if there is a clicked element, then do this. And this is the more traditional way, as we have been doing it all the time. But this is actually more modern because it looks a bit nicer, because we don't need to create all these additional blocks. So in this case, just this block. But sometimes when we have so many conditions, it can become a little bit confusing. And then it's a bit cleaner to simply return the function immediately if a certain condition is matched. And again, in this case, whenever there is no clicked element here, then we want to simply return the function right away. And so then that code here will not be executed. But otherwise, of course, it will be executed. And so let's now see what happens. So now clicking outside, nothing happens. Of course, we still get the null here, but no error occurs because now JavaScript is no longer trying to execute this line of code here. Okay. But now let's actually take care of basically putting all of these other buttons down, as I was saying. So when I click one of them, then the other ones should move down. So basically, we should remove this class from them, right? And so the solution to that is before we add this class here to anyone, we will simply remove it on all of the tabs. So we remove them on all. So that's all the tabs dot for each. And so each tab I'm simply calling T here, and then tab dot class list dot remove. And so now that should work. And yeah, it does. Okay, so this is something that we do quite usually. So basically clearing the class on all of them and then only add it afterwards on one of them. So let's add a comment here, active tab. But now finally, let's actually activate the content area itself, because that's the main part that we're actually interested in. Now, remember that the information about which content area should be displayed is here in this data attribute. So let me click again. And so in this case, we want the tab number 2. And so that's this number 2 is encoded here basically in this data attribute. So having the number 2 here means that we want to select the element which has the class of operations content 2. Okay, so let's do that. Let me grab this here. So this selector, and then let's select it. So document.querySelector. And now I'm using a template string here because, of course, we don't want to hardcode the number 2 here, but instead we want to get that exactly from the data attribute that I just showed you. So let me just show that again to you. Now we get an error here. Let's just put something there for now. So it is called data tab. Okay. And so remember, all these attributes are in the element and then in the dataset property. So the element that was clicked is indeed stored in our variable clicked, right? So every time we click a button, that button is then stored in the clicked variable. And so then .dataset .tab. So that's only the part after the data, remember? So it's just tab. So in this case, it's going to be 2. And so we already have that now selected, and then we want to add a special class to it. So that's ClassList.add. And let's just check out the class that we need to add. So we can see that here on the first content area, which is already active. And so the class here is OperationsContentActive. Okay, and one more time, you can check out the CSS to figure out why actually this makes the element active. And we can quickly do that ourselves. So here it is, actually, the active, right? And so basically what this does is to change the display property to something which is not none. So previously, without this active part, so just operation content makes it display none, which basically hides it. But then as it becomes active, we give it display grid and then specify all of these properties there. All right. So this should actually already be working. Just to really see this a bit better in the console also, let's log this value also to the console. Okay, but let's see. And indeed, it now appeared down here. Great. So it's no longer hidden. And indeed, we successfully read that value here from the data tab, which is 2. And the same is going to happen here for 3. And so you see that the content number 3 also appeared down here. Now, of course, this is not quite finished yet because we want the other ones to be hidden. So that's the whole idea of this component. And so basically all we need to do is to do the same that we did for the tabs. So basically removing the active class for all of them before then adding it to the one that we're interested in. All right, so basically just what we have here. So let's select all the contents, and that we actually already have here, right? So tabs content is also a node list because of query selector all that we can now loop over and then remove that active class from all of them. So tabs content dot for each, and I'm just calling it C very short here. So C for content. So class list remove. And so you see that it's always the same idea. So it's all about removing and adding classes to manipulate the page to look just like we want. All right. So this comment is actually more here. So activate tab. And here, remove the active classes for both the tab and the content areas. And with this, actually our component should already be working. So let's see. And yeah, beautiful. It works great. All right, let's just get rid of all these different console.logs here because we only need them for development. But now we're done. So let's just quickly recap. And as I just mentioned a minute ago, the whole idea when we build components like this is to just add and remove classes as necessary to manipulate the content to our needs. And actually the exact same thing we did with the modal window. So if you take a look at the code, it's a bit similar. So to hide and display the modal window, all we do is to add and remove this hidden class. Now in this case, it's a little bit more complex, but the idea is always the same. It's to work with classes that have some styles for showing and hiding the classes. And so if you're not yet really familiar with CSS, it's also important that you really check out the CSS to build these components for yourself. And the same goes for the HTML. But of course, I could not write this code here as well, because then this tutorial would take like 1 hour instead of 15 minutes. But anyway, I hope that this was fun. Make sure to understand what we did here, including the HTML and CSS. And then let's go right to the next video. Let's now create a nice effect on our page navigation where all the links fade out when we hover over one of them, except for the link that we actually hovered over. And this will teach us something really valuable, which is how to pass arguments into event handler functions. And the effect that I mean is this one. So when we hover over one of the links, you see all the others fade out like this, and that includes even the logo there on the left side. So let's do that here in our page, and let's again start by taking a look here at the HTML. So we have these links. So each of them is a nav link, and so these are the elements that we're going to be working with. So menu fade animation. But now, of course, we do not want to attach an event listener to each of these links. So we already know that we should do event delegation here instead. So let's find the common parent element of all of the links, and also including the logo there. So if we were only working with the links, it would be this element, but we also want to work with the logo here. And so let's actually use this entire navigation here as our parent container on which we will handle the event that is going to bubble up from the links. So keep in mind that all of this works because events bubble up from their target. So let's select the navigation here and store it in a variable .querySelector.nav. Okay, and actually let me put this here at the very top because we are going to need this a bit later. And it is a good practice to have all of these at the top. And the same actually here. So why not have all of the selections right at the top? That makes it a bit easier to understand the whole file. Okay. But anyway, let's now attach an event listener to that navigation. But now we're not going to use the click event, but instead the mouse over event. Okay. And I think that previously we have already used the mouse enter event, and mouse over is actually similar to mouse enter, with the big difference that mouse enter does not bubble. Okay. But here we need the event to actually bubble so that it can even reach the navigation element, and so therefore we use mouse over. All right. So then attach the function here. And there are also kind of opposite events of mouse over and mouse enter. And we use these to basically undo what we do on the hover. So the opposite of mouse enter is mouse leave, and the opposite of this mouse over is mouse out. And so we're also going to need that one. So let's put that here right away. So mouse out. All right. And as always, if you need to know more, then you can check out the MDN documentation. Great. So we have our parent element. And now, as always, we need to match the element that we are actually looking for. And so in this case, that are these elements with the navlink class on them. And so let's simply check for that. So if e.target, as you already know, .ClassList.contains the navlink class, well, then let's do something. So you see that this time around, I'm not using the closest methods. And that's because there are simply no child elements that we could accidentally click here in this link, right? So that was the reason why we needed the closest method here in this tabs, because we had this button, but then we could also click on the span element. And so here we then needed to find the closest element, so the closest button to both of these places. Okay, but here that's not necessary. And so therefore a simple check like we have here is enough. And so now we can actually say that the clicked is then e.target. Okay, So I called it clicked before. Let's call it now actually the link. But this is similar to what we did before also. So creating a variable which contains the element that we're working with. All right. And so now, next up, we need to select the sibling elements. So basically all the other links. All right. And remember that we can do that by going to the parent and then selecting the children from there. Now, in this case, actually the parent of navLink is this navItem. And the only thing that navItem includes is always just one link. So you see that each of the link is actually inside of one navItem like this. And so now we would have to move up manually, not just once, but twice. And so instead of doing that, we will again use the closest method. Okay? So again, instead of moving up manually like 1 or 2 steps, we can simply search for a parent which matches a certain query. And so that's a bit more robust, because even if we would then at some point maybe change the structure of this HTML here, then our JavaScript would keep working. All right, so let's say our link, and then find the closest parent, and let's actually search for nav again. Okay, even though that's not the closest parent, I mean, there is another parent to these links, which is this one here, but it's no problem of also choosing an even higher up parent like we are doing here. So we are now at a parent of all of the links, and so now from there we can search for the nav links again. And so these are then going to be the siblings of our initial links. And so, as we already learned before, we can use query selector on an element to search for a certain query only in that element. Okay, and we are looking for these nav links, of course. And now let's actually also select the logo, and we could select it manually also by its class name, but let's just suppose that there are many navigations on this page. And so again, to make the solution really robust, it's best to simply move up to the closest parent, in this case the navigation, and then from there we simply search for an image. All right, and so this then will work not only on this navigation, but it would work also on others. So this selector here is simply for any image which has the image tag. Okay, all right, so we have all our elements selected. Now we just need to change the opacity, basically of the siblings of the selected link. So siblings.forEach, and now we actually need to do that comparison that we did before. So checking if the current element is not the link itself. Because of course this sibling here, so these siblings, they will contain our initial link as well. Okay, so it needs to be different from link. And actually here we need a query selector all, right? We want all the links, not just the first occurrence. Okay, but then for all the others that are not the original link, we want to change the opacity to 0.5. And indeed, we want to do the same with the logo. So logo.style. And let's see what we have already. And you see that it works, right? Beautiful. Now, the thing is that, of course, it doesn't go back. So once we have it at 0.5, it will not automatically go back to the opacity of 1, which is the original one. You see? So when I hover this, all the others become 0.5, but as I move out, then everything remains the same. Okay? And so that's why we have this mouse out event to basically undo what we did here. So let's take all of this, paste it here, and change this to 1. All right. And so let's see what happens now. And yeah, everything goes back to 1. And so this actually works. Now, of course, it doesn't work with the logo because this entire effect only works if the target contains the navlink class, right? But that wasn't the point anyway. We just wanted this to work on any of the links. And notice that this button here is actually also a link element, and so it also works on that one. All right. So our effect here is actually working already, but this is of course very repetitive. So the code here is always the same, and so we need to make our code a little bit more dry here, of course. So let's refactor this code. And usually refactoring works by creating a new function. And so let's do that here. Of function, and we will need some arguments here, but more about that later. So what we need to do now is to compare these two pieces of code that we are trying to refactor, and then figure out what is the same and what is different. So in this case, that's pretty simple. So all that changes is that here we have the opacity 0.5, and here we have the opacity of 1. And so we can simply take this code and create an argument or a parameter for that opacity. And we can then pass that opacity into the function. All right. So of course we also need the event here. So that's going to be the first one. And then we need the opacity. And so here we simply replace that by opacity. Okay. And so like this, we refactored our code very nicely here. But now, how do we actually use this function here? So usually when we have the event handler as a separate function, all we do here is to pass in that function, and then it's going to work just like this, right? So we have done this many times throughout this course, right? But now the problem is that we actually want to pass in values into this function, right? So we need to tell this function to use the opacity of 0.5 in this case and of 1 in this case. All right. Also, we need a way of passing this event. So right now, none of this would work. So let me show that to you. So not clicking, of course, but you see it would not really work. Okay. So maybe you would think that we could do this. So like maybe passing an event here and then 0.5, which is the opacity that we want. But this, of course, is not going to work. So the first problem is that E is, of course, not defined. But the main problem really here is that addEventListener here expects a function. So we need to pass a function. But if we call the function, then all of this here will become some other value. In this case, that's undefined because we don't return anything from this function. All right. And so this is simply not going to work. So we talked about this many times, but it's always good to remember that JavaScript indeed expects here a function and not just some other regular value, which would be the result of calling the function like this. Now the solution to this problem would be to still have a callback function here, like a regular one, which JavaScript will then call for us whenever the event happens. And then in here, we could then actually call this function with the event, which is this one, and then our opacity, so 0.5. And so this works because here we are basically calling the function manually. So this will only be executed as soon as JavaScript executes this function value. And so here we are back to working because here we are back to passing in a real function. Okay? And then let's right away do the same here. Set it to 1. And now it should be working again. And it does indeed. Okay, so that is the second version of our code working, but we can actually do even better and remove these anonymous callbacks functions here all together. So this looks a little bit ugly, right? Like having just this one function, which in turn will call another function. And so, as I just said, we can do even better, and that is by using the bind method that we already studied before. So remember that the bind method creates a copy of the function that it's called on, and it will set the this keyword in this function call to whatever value that we pass into bind. Okay, so let me just do that here in practice. So handle hover and then dot bind. Okay, and I think we actually already did an example like this. So using bind in an event handler. And so let's set 0.5 here just as before. All right, and now let's do the same here. So handle hover dot bind and then 1. And so this is going to work because this is going to be also a function, because bind, remember, returns a new function. Now in this function, the this variable will now be set to this value, so to 1 here and to 0.5. And so let's check that out. So the this variable, okay. And so now you see indeed that it is either 1 or 0.5. All right. Now remember that usually the this keyword is equal to current target. So let's also check that. Okay. But current target will of course remain unaltered. So you see that it is still of course the navigation element. Okay, so by default the this keyword is the same as the current target, so the element on which the event listener is attached to. But when we then set the this keyword manually, of course it becomes whatever we set it to. And so now, just like before, we can use that this keyword and use that here. All right, because the this keyword is now our opacity. And so essentially we use the bind method here to pass an argument into a handler function. So let me just write that here. Passing an argument into handler. And I'm using quotes here because of course this is not really an argument. So in fact, we don't even need this here. And in fact, it is impossible to pass another argument into an event handler function. So any handler function like this one can only ever have one real argument. And so in this case, can only ever have one real parameter, and that is the event. But if we want to pass additional values into the handler function, then we need to use the this keyword like we just did here. And if we wanted multiple values, then we could of course pass in here like an array or an object instead of just one value. So this is kind of a workaround into the fact that the handler function can only take one argument. So it's a really nice effect, and as I said in the beginning, it also taught us how we can pass arguments essentially into handler functions. Let's implement another pretty common feature on web pages, which is that the navigation bar becomes attached to the top of the page after we scroll to a certain point. And this is called a sticky navigation, and so let's build one for our site. So the effect that I'm talking about is this one. So as we scroll down, once we then reach a certain point, the menu bar here becomes attached to the top of the page. And once again, I'm sure that you have seen this in many pages that you visit. Now let's just check out the HTML here just to see how this works. So we make this navigation sticky basically by adding this sticky class whenever we reach a certain position. And so this sticky class, as you can see here on the right side, all it does is to set the position to fixed, and it also changes the background color to this transparent. So you see that we can actually see through this navigation a little bit, which gives it a really cool effect. Okay. So sticky navigation. And to implement this, we're going to use the scroll event for now. So there's actually a better way of what we're going to do in this video, but let's start by working with the scroll event now, because sometimes that's good to know as well. So the scroll event is available on window. All right, so not document, but really window.add event listener and then scroll. Okay, so this event will be fired off each time that we scroll on our page. Okay, and let's start by taking a look actually at the event, just so you see that it actually fires each time that I'm scrolling. So I just scrolled this little bit and it already created all of these events. So it fired all these times. So the scroll event is not really efficient and usually it should be avoided. But again, for now, let's use that. And now let's start by getting our current scroll position. So let's use window.scroll y, just as we learned before. And so this scroll position here is really on the window object and not at the event. So in the scroll event, this event object here is actually pretty useless. We don't even need it here. Okay, so let's just reload here. And so as we scroll, you see that each time the event is fired, we get the current scroll position. And remember that this is the position basically from the point in the viewport, so this point here, to the very top of the page. And that's why in the beginning we start at 0, because now the visible part of the site is exactly also at the top of the page. Okay, so remember, to make the navigation sticky, we will add that sticky class that I showed you earlier. But now the question is, when exactly should the navigation actually become sticky? Well, it should happen here as soon as we reach the first section. So basically as soon as we reach this position. So this line here marks the beginning of the first section. And so when we reach this position, we want to make the navigation sticky. Now, of course, we're not gonna like hard code the value here. So I could take like 565, but that doesn't work because the size of this element that comes before is actually dependent on the viewport size. So if I do this, then you see that the first section starts way earlier. So like at 300. And so we cannot hard code the value. And therefore, we need to calculate it dynamically. So how do we do that? Well, remember that we can determine the position actually of this first section. So let's do that. And I think I already have it selected up here. Yeah, so section 1, which is this one. So we need to do this outside actually of this event handler. So that section 1 dot get bounding client rect, remember. And so let's call this initial coordinates, so just coords, and take a look at it. And so now we get this current top value here. Where is it? Ah, right here. So we get the current top value of this section. And so we can now work with that. And it's even better if we do this when scrolled to the top, because then basically this top position here is all the way from the top of the page all the way here. So all the way to the beginning of that first section. Okay, and so let's now use this value to add our sticky class. So we can say that whenever the window.scroll position in y is greater than the initial coordinates at the top, then we want to add this sticky class, right? And if not, then we want to remove it. So I can use nav here because I already selected it in the previous lecture. So nav is of course this entire navigation bar that we also worked with in the previous lecture. So remove here. And here indeed we need a new line. And so now that works. And so let's check this here. And wait for it. And indeed, now it's here. So now the sticky class was added because we reached the position in the page which is greater than the distance of this first section from the top. All right. So this works just fine now, but as I mentioned before, this is pretty bad for performance. So using the scroll event for performing a certain action at a certain position of the page is really not the way to go. And again, that's because the scroll event here fires all the time, no matter how small the change is here in the scroll. And so that makes for a pretty bad performance, and especially on mobile. Like on a modern computer, of course, you're not going to notice anything. But if you're using this page maybe on an older smartphone, then it's not going to be so nice. All right. And so in the next video, we're going to look at a better and way more efficient tool, which is the Intersection Observer API.